The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us in this important webinar series on safe and healthy homes. This webinar is on lead service line replacement with a look at national, state, and local initiatives. Next slide, please. That's me. I'm Wendy Patton. I'm with Policy Matters Ohio. We're a nonpartisan research organization with the mission of contributing to a more vibrant, equitable, inclusive, and sustainable Ohio. I'll moderate the session with three leaders in protecting the environment and the community at the national, state, and local level: Tom Neltner, Christy Meyer, and Alexis Smith. I'll tell you who they are in just a moment, but just a few details first. Next slide, please. We want to thank our sponsors who made this webinar series possible: the Coalition on Homelessness and Housing in Ohio, COHIO, the Ohio Capital Corporation for Housing, the Environmental Defense Fund, Huntington Bank, Nationwide Children's Hospital, the Ohio Lead-Free Kids Coalition, the Mount Sinai Healthcare Foundation, the Ohio Housing Finance Agency, and People Working Cooperatively's Whole Home Innovation Center. Next slide, please. The next slide will give us some basic ground rules on the webinar. All participants are muted. We want to hear from you. You're muted during the presentations. After each presentation, there will be a period for clarifying questions only. We're going to save the discussion for the end. Use the questions feature in the GoToWebinar control panel to submit your questions. This PowerPoint is going to be posted to the Ohio Healthy Homes Network's website, and it's also available on your download. So you can go to the handout section. There's one handout. You can download the materials from this webinar as you're watching it. And you need to know this webinar is being recorded. On to introductions for our panelists. The next slide, please. Oh, an important point. If you're looking for registered CEs or you want to leave us our thoughts, stay tuned and fill out the evaluation form, please. All right, now on to our panelists. Christy Meyer is an associate director at Freshwater Future. She supports community groups in forwarding equitable policies and regulations for clean, safe, affordable, and accessible drinking water in communities throughout the Great Lakes states and provinces. Previously, as Vice President of Policy with the Ohio Environmental Council, Christie led and co-led critical work that transformed the ability of the Lake Erie region to respond to its most significant challenges. She brings more than 15 years of experience in policy and campaign development, team building, and nonprofit leadership. Christie has a BS in environmental biology and business administration from Heidelberg University in Tiffin, Ohio. She earned an MS from James Cook University in Queensland, Australia, where she worked with Aboriginals on natural resource management issues and formed a greening strategy for all of Northern Australia, including Papua New Guinea, although she too is a native of the Buckeye State. Next slide, please. We're going to hear from panelist Tom Neltner, who is the Environmental Defense Fund's Chemicals Policy Director. He leads efforts to move on or minimize hazardous chemicals from products in the marketplace through cross-cutting policy initiatives. His primary focus is on food additive safety and reducing exposure to lead in our homes and communities. He's a chemical engineer and attorney with experience in chemical safety issues in the workplace, the environment, the home, consumer products, and food. Tom's worked on lead poisoning prevention at the federal, state, and local levels for more than 20 years. It is not required to be a Buckeye to be on this panel, but we all are. Tom started out in the Buckeye State, although he lived longer in Cincinnati and identifies as a Hoosier. Next slide, please. Our third presenter, Alexis Smith, is going to tell us about engaging the Junction community in Toledo on environmental issues. This is the story of her life. She has lived and been a resident of the Junction community since birth. She started her journey of community engagement at 12 years old, working with other youth leaders to keep their neighborhood clean, safe, and informed. After high school, Alexis attended a 5-year engineering program at the University of Toledo, working with the city in their Geographic Information Systems department. She's worked with the spine orthopedics industry at Life Spine Incorporated. She's built databases and engaged youth for Freshwater Future. She graduated from the University of Toledo with a Bachelor of Science in Bioengineering last year, and she stayed with Freshwater Future full-time, working on many projects, including their stormwater app, youth and community engagement, and meanwhile supporting Freshwater Future in all of its technology needs. Alexis still lives in the Junction community and has used her talents, networks, and resources to strengthen and sustain community voice and action. Next slide, please. All right, so water matters, and water in Ohio is an issue that should be of concern to all of us. Next slide, please. The Ohio Department of Health estimates that 12% of Cleveland kids that have been tested have lead poisoning at or above the level that triggers public health action. Children across the state, Zanesville, Cambridge, census tracts in Perry County share the same dangerous risk of lead poisoning as Cleveland, Canton, and Dayton. Lead poisoning can damage brains and nervous systems. It can slow development, impair hearing and speech, and bring about behavior problems. Exposure to even low levels is dangerous. The greatest risk is in brain development, where irreversible damage can occur. In the last budget, advocates asked lawmakers to allocate $12.6 million to Medicaid funds to match and bring in an additional $24 million in federal funds to support lead investigations and provide case management, treatment, remediation. There were other requests as well. The state legislature responded. The budget for 2020-21 contained more than $20 million in new funding to address lead poisoning. It created new policies, regulations, and partnerships. Legal remediation of toxic home has been and is being stiffened. Poisoned children are the target for remedial services. Medicaid funding will be used in new ways to treat children and rehabilitate toxic homes. In September, the governor announced an additional almost $45 million in HUD, Housing and Urban Development Funds, to local governments for abatement and remediation. This is great stuff, but the problem doesn't stop there. In 2016, national news reported that lead had poisoned the water system in the community of Sebring, Ohio. There was an investigation of possible lead poisoning in Dayton. The state now requires localities and counties to provide maps of water lines that may contain lead. These maps reveal densely populated areas with aging service lines at risk for lead contamination. I've got just a sampling for you to look at very quickly. Next slide, please. This is the community of Campbell, which is a suburb of Youngstown. The yellow lines represent water lines with possible contamination of solder, fixture, and pipes containing lead. There's a lot of them. Next slide, please. This is the response of the city of Canton, and it is what's up on the Ohio EPA website about their lead lines. It says the city of Canton claims to have no known lead service lines. Next slide, please. This is the Cleveland public water system. The darker the color, the more intense and more concentrated the presence of lines with lead contamination. Next slide, please. This is Columbus. You can see the density there. Next slide, please. This is Indian Hills. Indian Hills is a wealthy suburb of Cincinnati. The red lines show where there may be lead in the service lines. There's not very many. You see, this is a tough problem. Lots of communities are affected, but not every community. So it's a tough nut to crack. With that, I'm going to start turning it over to our able panelists to describe the problem and tell us what's being done at the national, state, and local level. We'll start with Tom Neltner of the Environmental Defense Fund.
There we go. I'm unmuted. Hopefully you can hear me now. All right. Wendy, thanks for that great introduction. And it's nice to be here. I'm from the Southwest Ohio. My wife grew up in the Tiffin area, Findlay and all that. So I have roots on the western side of the state. So what I want to do now is sort of give you that national perspective, a taste of Ohio, what we know of Ohio from a national perspective, but also make a link to healthy homes. So Parker, if you could go to the next slide. So this is a map that EPA produced right in 2017. It's published in Environmental Health Perspectives. And what it does is it plotted all the children out in deciles. So each bar represents 10% of the kids younger than in that age range, 0 to 6 months. And you'll notice that the most exposed kids are on the right. Gray is lead from dust, paint, and soil. Blue is from water. Green is from food, and you never see the orange bar at the bottom because inhalation is just very small for children. So when you see for the most exposed kids, water is an important source, not as dominant as paint. When it gets to the next 20%, the 80 to 90th percentile, you get about even, and that's primarily from infant formula. Now remember, we don't test these kids. So when we talk about the percent of kids that have been found to be lead poisoned, we don't check for those kids. We don't test them because they're not typically exposed to dust. The next slide highlights that. So what happens is once a kid turns 1, they really stop drinking water. They start drinking a lot of other sources, and their sole source for nutrition is an infant formula. So what you'll see is for almost all the kids, dust, soil dominates, that's paint, and water becomes pretty small. When you get to the bottom 2/3, you'll see that food dominates. That's because food is a regular contaminant of carrots and sweet potatoes and squash and grapes and apples and all that. So it's because it's in our natural environment. Next slide. So when you think about where it's coming from, the drinking water, there are a couple sources. One is internal plumbing. That is there. It's happening even today. If you go out and buy a faucet from the shelf at Home Depot, it's got lead added to the brass. That's why we have corrosion control to manage those. But the lead pipe, that's the blue, dark blue line, that runs from the water main to the house, that is the main source. That is the most significant source of lead, and it's one that corrosion control can control and reduce, but not sustainably keep it down. Now here it's important to note that there's this curb stop, usually at the curb or at the sidewalk, and the part that's on between the water main and the curb stop is called the public side, and the part that's on the private is the private side. And most utilities consider that the part on private property is the responsibility of the owner. But I'm guessing most people never picked out a home based on looking for a lead pipe or trying to avoid one, because we generally don't know where they're at. Partial lead service line replacements increase exposure for a few months, and it can sustain for longer. There's about 6.1 to 9.3 million lead service lines across the country. Next slide. Okay, corrosion control, as I mentioned, has its limits. So you look at the left of that photo is a lead pipe. In the middle is a corroded steel pipe, probably galvanized. Nobody wants to drink out of this pipe, but the lead pipe is just going to put lead in instead of iron and other junk. The corrosion control often phosphates, which some communities in Ohio use, is that yellow coating inside. That's a corrosion control work. It does a lot to reduce it by binding the lead, much like a really good encapsulant does, but it's not permanent. And if you have changes in the water, both disturbance to the pipe or changes in the water, you can see increases. That was Sebring and Flint. Also, the first draw sample that we often talk about misses this, because this is under the ground out to the street. So if you're relying on first draw sampling, you're actually missing the spike. So when the water chemistry changes or you're disturbing a pipe, you're going to get an increase. And if you disturb the pipe, it can actually result in particulate that gets hung up in the filter, the screen that's at the end of your faucet, so it can come out over time. Lead service line replacement is a disturbance, but so is shutting off the water and then turning it back on. Filters, lead certified, NS53 lead certified filters help and really do reduce it, but they're tough to use because consistently, because not everybody uses them for the bathroom, for instance. They're in the kitchen, or they're costly in the long run. If you want to replace the lead pipe, the averages run about $5,000 overall, about $3,500 for the part on private property, and $1,500 for the part on private public. It varies dramatically. Next slide. So where are the lead service lines? Illinois is number one. It's got 730,000 according to the latest estimate. You're number two in Ohio. That is 650,000. It's a little bit behind Illinois in the wrong way. 434,000 of those are in the 24 largest utilities, and then the rest break down according to the size, and you can see the numbers there. That's an estimate from 4 years ago that's based on a survey from 7 years ago, so it's really rough. Let's move to the next slide. So for those working in the healthy homes area, recognize the similarities between paint and pipes. First, but that actually should say between windows. I want to highlight it's windows. I mistyped that. Windows and pipes. Both paint, all lead-based paint and lead, it's a legacy of past decisions. We put lots of lead on windows because it makes them last longer. They're better resistant to the sun, better resistant to the moisture. It's just like the pipes. They were better resistant to everything. So it's a toxic legacy of past decisions. I'm not saying bad decisions, although I don't like either. Also, eliminating exposure is not realistic. We're still going to have lead in the homes. We're still going to have lead in the pipes. If you buy a brand new faucet today, it's got lead added to it, and it'll leach it, especially in the first 3 weeks of use. Disturbing it, just like disturbing lead-based paint, increases the risk. But lead window frames and lead pipes are the most significant sources, and both are the hardest to manage. The pipe is just so significant, it can be disrupted, just like the window frame and the windows when you raise and lower them, or the sunlight and the water damage. There is no inventory of homes with either, but on paint or pipes, it's poised to get better. There will be address-specific information for the entire nation over the next 3 years. It's also a shared responsibility where they're either looking to the landlord or we're looking to the utility. There are some differences. For paint, we have a sort of hazard standard. It's not really a full hazard standard, but for water, it's absolutely not. It is about corrosion control. don't suggest that the water standard is the health-based standard. It doesn't mean it's safe. It just means that the corrosion control was working well enough. Different sources of funding, that we get different pockets here. That's important to recognize. We're not competing for the same dollars when you deal with paint and pipes. Funding of low-income residents, there is on paint, but not really on water. There's really no subsidy given. Disclosure happens on paint, sort of, and not on water, and that's not at all. And then there's broad consumer access to paint sampling tools, not so much on water. Next slide. So communities are leading the way. 9 have eliminated lead service lines, none of those in Ohio. 110 have committed to eliminating lead service lines, only 1 in Ohio, and that's Greater Cincinnati Waterworks, and frankly, they're a national leader. 78 are taking action, mostly by posting maps and trying to educate the public on them. And that's Cleveland, Columbus, Toledo, and Northwestern are the ones we've identified. And you'll see that link on tracking. That'll give you more information when you download the link. Okay, next. And states are supporting those communities, and we're tracking progress again. 17 have adopted beneficial policies since Flint. Michigan's by far the national leader with the most aggressive comprehensive program, calling for the elimination of lead pipes in 20 years. 3 states have set elimination goal. In addition to Michigan, there's New Jersey and Washington State. 12 states provide access to funding. I listed the ones in the Midwest. Ohio is a little on the lonely side there. I mean, where is it in this mix? It's only, I think the only one we're missing from the Midwest is none in all the adjacent states. Okay, Ohio's right up there with Kentucky. 10 states, I was born in Kentucky, by the way, so I can push it a little bit. 10 states have lead service line inventories of some type. In the Midwest, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin have mandatories. Indiana has maps, but no real inventory, so we don't know how good that 640,000 number is. Next slide. Told you this was going to be a whirlwind. Any day now, we're anticipating getting revisions to the 1991 lead and copper rule that EPA adopted. These will be the first major revisions. It's literally, we've been waiting for it for 3 weeks now. And the agency is, I know, actively working on it. So it could drop now, today or tomorrow. What it does is it expands the definition of lead service lines primarily to include ones that were galvanized, steel pipes that had a short piece of lead pipe in it. So steel, galvanized steel is considered a lead service line. It also adds a trigger in addition to the 15 parts per billion action level that complements it by getting things rolling. So when somebody does hit the 15, they've got to act much more aggressively. Also, only homes with lead service lines are going to be sampled. And that means that a lot more homes, a lot more communities that are saying they're below the action level and everything's fine are going to be triggering it. Estimates are about 30 to 40% of utilities, but that's a really rough one. It also adds obligation to test schools and childcare centers. Utilities are going to be responsible over 5 years for testing every school and childcare center. And it also makes publicly available the location of known lead service lines and lines of unknown material. So in 3 years, every utility has to make that publicly available. And if it's more than 100,000 people, 100,000 customers served, it has to be electronically available. That's why I say we're going to get maps. And annually, customers are going to get notified if they have a lead service line or they have one of unknown material. So dramatically increased information on this one. My dream is to have those maps of lead pipes also be complemented with maps of homes with lead paint. So we actually get the full picture. And we don't go declaring a home as lead safe when we've taken care of lead paint and left it with somebody drinking through what's effectively a lead straw. Next slide. Okay, here's an example of Cincinnati's lead service line map, and I like it. It's better than Columbus's. I will say that because it covers both sides of the line. And it provides you with information as to whether it's on the public side, whether it's known to be lead or not, or it also tells you it's don't know. It's very hard for utilities to say, I don't know, but it's critical because you can't begin to fill in the gaps if you don't check. Next slide. So maps are going to be common. Also, there's going to be these notices, and there's going to be notice to the public, general public. That's them making it online. There's also going to be specific notice to the customer, usually the property owner, and to the consumer. The resident will get, even in a rental situation, will get notice. That'll all be happening. And I'll also clarify that you could in Ohio, like other states, Illinois, Wisconsin, New York, Connecticut, Delaware and Connecticut, they actually require that in a home sale, the prospective home buyer be notified. But that's not the case in Ohio. Next slide. So just to frame it, and this is important for paint side too, but we did a survey of Ohio residents looking at likelihood of performing action in response to a lead service line replacement status. So this is Ohio data. If lead is present on either side of the service line, that's the first bar, and then the second bar is lead status is unknown. So if you have a lead service line, 88 to 90% of the people insisted that the owner had to confirm the lead service line status. And that's because there's going to be public information, we think. It also, when it comes to insisting a person replace the line, again, it's around 90% are going to insist that the owner replace it. And remember, it's not like paint where it's an interior feature that people buy the home for and it costs a lot more. It's more like radon with a discernible price that's manageable. Some people, about 81 to 88%, or if it's unknown, about 60% would look for another home. Some people are going to go ahead and move in and pay, and then some people are just going to leave it alone. And that's what we saw in Ohio with and this was in a peer-reviewed published study. Next slide. What I want to do is warn you that if you suggest sampling, you're actually undermining the overall effort. Because if you test the water, what we consistently see, and that's the bars, that if it tests above the EPA level, then it's the same response as if there were no water tests at all. But if you test and they show that it's below the EPA level, which remember isn't representative of the exposure just a few liters later, and it doesn't show what'll happen tomorrow, you're going to get less interest, less response, and they're going to be more likely to leave the pipes alone. Testing alone is ineffective. It's got value, but not in either helping to find the lead service line or triggering action. So if that's a solution, don't do it. It's a waste of time, partly because it gives you only a snapshot. It's not like lead dust hazards on the floor, which the lead dust doesn't go away. In this case, it comes and goes. Next slide. So we have to talk when you're talking about lead and environmental justice. And for paint, we've talked about environmental justice for years. So, but we did a study in DC Water, Washington, DC, where they did about 3,400 lead service line replacements, and about half of those were partials. And that's because they made it easy for people to participate, unlike in most communities. So in this DC Water, they require customers to pay to replace the lead service lines. And what we found is that disproportionately benefited the wealthy, leaving low-income and Black residents behind. It exacerbated the structural racism that's already in DC, because income and race correlate real strongly in DC and in many other communities. Put simply, if you got the money, you were willing to pay. But how many people have a couple $1,000s of cash that they're willing to put up? There was no loan program or anything else. They made it easier, but it benefited the wealthy white residents. The trick is, EPA's proposed rule that's supposed to be finalized now is modeled after DC Water's program. It makes it easier, and it will benefit the wealthy and exacerbate environmental justice challenges. Next slide. What we also saw is communicating makes a big difference. That if you're wondering about the value of putting reminders to use lead-safe work practices in a building permit, in DC, they put a reminder to replace your lead service line when people got their building permit, and the number of voluntary customer-initiated replacements went from about 25 a year up to about 400 a year. And when they put maps online, it doubled again. So really, mapping and that educational opportunity when they get a building permit, it works on lead service lines. I have every reason to think it will work on building permits if we could do, or for paint, if we could do it. Next slide. So what are the benefits of replacing lead service lines? Now, we've talked for years about IQ. I've talked for years about IQ. But the reality is that as they estimate cardiovascular disease, social and economic benefits from death, people tend not to like to die, the numbers actually swamp the IQ. Now, what they do is they say that every person values his life at $10 million. So I'm telling you how that math works. But EPA has, thanks to work by Bruce Lanphier, has linked in a dose response model that was peer reviewed in June of 2019, cardiovascular deaths to the lead service or to blood lead exposure. This will work for paint. This will work for workers, everybody. It's a model that's now was published last month in Environmental Health Perspectives. We took that model and applied it to lead service lines, to lead and copper rule. And what we found is that the cardiovascular deaths were on par with the IQ benefits. So reduced IQ benefits were on par for the lead and copper rule. And again, the cardiovascular deaths are being measured over 35 years. But if you were to replace all the lead service lines in the country, it will save $205 billion, and the cost will be about $45 billion. That's a savings of $22,000 per lead service line replacement, a 400% return on investment. Yes, it's a long-term investment. That's what our society should be looking at, especially when we're talking about kids. And for some people, kids matter, but for some people, they're a little on the selfish side, and the fact that it affects adults rings with them. So you can use both factors to make it. Next slide. So there are federal legislative efforts to fund that service line replacement. The House has amended the Moving Forward Act, the stimulus bill, and provided $22.5 billion for lead service line replacement, prioritizing disadvantaged and environmental justice communities. And from what I can tell, for the first time, we have in a bill that cleared the House or any chamber, a definition of an environmental justice community. In addition, the House Appropriations provided $1 billion in emergency spending. So the House is willing to fund it. I don't have any dreams that it'll pass the Senate this time. But if you look forward, depending on how the election goes, that may have some traction next year. But it also shows you the power of combining the economic argument with the environmental justice argument, and you can get some movement. Next slide. So lead service, I want to just highlight that there is a group of 27 national public health, water utility, environmental, labor, consumer, housing, state and local governmental organizations that are part of the Lead Service Line Replacement Collaborative, including NEHA and APHA, but also NCHH and GHHI. The goal of those 27 groups is to accelerate lead service line replacement. It is called the Lead Service Line Replacement Collaborative. We're never very creative about names, and I provide the link there. Next slide. So that's my contact information. Any questions? And we're only looking for clarifying questions now, but you can log in the rest and we'll get to them. Anything? Okay, clear as anything. Your turn, Christy.
All right, thank you, Tom. And we'll move now to Christy Meyer to give us some background on state and regional initiatives. Christy?
Thank you, Wendy. Thanks, Tom. Really great introduction and presentation. Want to thank Ohio Healthy Homes Network for asking me to speak today, and all of you for joining. I'm just going to introduce Freshwater Future a little bit. Freshwater Future is a binational Great Lakes region-wide nonprofit. It's a catalyst for community action that helps to move policies designed to safeguard the waters of the Great Lakes region, and is a collaborative and entrepreneurial organization that seeks perspective from diverse communities and individuals. And we build partnerships and collaboration, work to ensure equity in the solutions we advocate for, and value residents' knowledge and abilities in our work to protect and restore the health of all the waters of the Great Lakes region. We do this by providing financial resources to groups to support them to implement on-the-ground solutions, as well as empower their organizational growth, provide customized coaching services to increase organizational effectiveness, and work collaboratively on local, state, regional, and national issues to find solutions. And we facilitate new connections among organizations all around the region. Our home office is based in Petoskey, Michigan, but we have offices throughout the Great Lakes region and 2 in Ohio, one in Toledo where Alexis is, and one where I am in Columbus, Ohio. So next slide, please. Oh, I think that was, yeah, next slide. So we heard from Wendy mention Sebring, Ohio, and many of you may recall in 2016, families in Sebring were unable to use their water and school drinking fountains were closed off due to high levels of lead in the water. And shortly after this news broke, it was like lead and water issues spread across the state like wildfire. And as a result, the General Assembly passed House Bill 512, and this was in 2016, and it deals with lead and water issues, including mapping, as both Wendy and Tom mentioned, which we'll talk a bit more about in a minute. But in addition, it also shortened public notification to 2 days to individuals so that if they got their water sample, they'd receive their results in 2 days. And it also required the utilities to allow or to tell customers within their water footprint if there was an exceedance in their system. It requires all lead tests to be processed within 30 days. Originally, it could take up to 6 months. It puts in checks and balances to ensure the local water utility operator was adhering to testing and notification requirements, such as the event that the local water utility operator failed to do their proper job of notification, which did happen. The Ohio EPA director must notify the individual and the community within 10 days of receiving the lab results. It requires water utilities to undertake a corrosion control treatment study when there's a major change at the utility, such as a switch from a change in a water source. And it lowered the allowable amount of lead in fixtures and water pipes to 0.25% of lead allowable in the fixtures and water pipes. It provides water utilities with greater loan flexibility so they can apply for a loan for corrosion control treatment, mapping of lead service lines, and lead service line replacement. And it provided $12 million for schools and daycares to replace fountains, fixtures, and lead service lines. And I was told that anybody that had asked for money, any community or school or daycare, did receive funding to replace that fixture or lead line. It puts into place penalties for not following the rules and laws that set out. And as we heard, it required mapping of the lead service lines in each water utility footprint and allowed the Ohio EPA to request further testing at daycares and schools. But unfortunately, the majority of the communities across the state do not really, as we heard, know where their lead service lines are located. And I remember meeting with the Ohio EPA and looking at some of those maps that were submitted, and some communities took a photocopy of their whole community, put a huge circle around it, and put a big question mark in the middle. So some communities absolutely have no idea, where others made estimates based on the size of the pipe and what year the pipe was installed. So we don't really have a clear, accurate understanding of what we have in Ohio. That is an estimate. I do know the Ohio EPA is working with local water utilities to support them in identifying where those lead service lines are located, but much more is needed, and I'll talk about that shortly. Also, lead in children, as we know, are 2 issues that are very near and dear to the heart of Governor DeWine. And in late 2019, Governor DeWine formed a lead advisory task force, and they started to pull together some recommendations. I would say for lead service lines, a lot of it is low-hanging fruit. But I do appreciate the governor's thought process of looking at all the ways that are most vulnerable are impacted. And I see this as an opportunity for what I call a one-touch approach to removing lead from homes. I think, as Tom talked about, meaning when we're removing lead from paint and from windows, let's also make sure that we're removing it from lead fixtures, from the pipes. Governor DeWine also has developed a funding program to deal with a number of water issues across the state, including lead service line replacement called H2 Ohio. Right now, a lot of that funding is going to daycares and schools, but I do know that some money has been allocated to the city of Cincinnati as well as Cleveland. So These are all really great steps in the right direction, but we have a lot more to do to protect our most vulnerable. So building off that great work and knowledge we have learned from community members in Michigan and Ohio, like the Junction Coalition, which you'll hear from next, Freshwater Future partnered up with the Alliance for the Great Lakes and the Ohio Environmental Council. And as members of the Ohio Lead-Free Kids Coalition, we've been pushing for the following Ohio legislative priorities. To ban partial lead service line replacements and require full lead line replacement, public and private side, by 2040. The creation of an Office of Lead Service Line Replacement within the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency that would work with localities to fully replace lead lines. Require the inventory of all service lines by material type, including the private side of service lines. And as you recall, we've said that we really don't have an accurate inventory. So like lead, potentially lead, likely not lead, copper, so forth. Requiring the Ohio EPA to work with public water systems to identify grant opportunities for lead service line replacement programs, and encourage public water systems to create programs that provide financial assistance to low-income customers to replace their part of the lead service line. Allow customers to pay that can the remaining costs for private lead service line replacement through the water bill or upfront, and then adopt a health-based standard for lead in drinking water, and require filters to be given to any household, school, daycare, or elderly facility that has a lead exceedance until the lead service line can be replaced, and 6 months after to protect people from any lead that's maybe jostled in replacing that lead line that got into the water column. So we're having ongoing conversations with state legislators, the governor's lead advisory task force, and the Ohio EPA. But really now is the time to put these policies into place. We cannot afford to wait any longer to protect our most vulnerable and our fellow Ohioans. Clean, safe, affordable drinking water is a basic human need and right. And as a parent, I know how hard we work to protect our kids. No parent should have to worry about whether the water they're mixing with baby formula or providing their loved ones or their husband or their wife or their girlfriend, you name it, has lead in it. So next slide, please. Yeah, any clarifying questions I'll take now, and then if there are none, I'll turn it back over to Wendy.
Okay, thank you so much, Christy. And next we'll hear from Alexa Smith, who runs and works with youth on the local level and keeps her community engaged in clean water issues. Alexis.
Well, thank you so much, Wendy and OHHN for having me. I'm very just excited to share a stage with such amazing panelists and to be here and speak on behalf of my community. Next slide, please. So who is Junction Coalition? Well, Junction, the name Junction comes from our business district of our community, and it is the coalition of neighborhood folks. It's for and by the community, by our neighborhood residents. We're based on 4 pillars of justice, and we serve over 7,000 residents in the central city, Toledo. Those 4 pillars of justice being social justice, environmental justice, and economic justice, and peace education. And why we decided to create this organization is because, well, what we realized in our community in particular in the Toledo area, we are plagued with disparities in terms of the wealth gap, in terms of being a food desert, in terms of having all of these issues of environmental justice, in terms of being plagued with a lot of lead pipes, a lot of lead in paint. And, put it simply, as our co-founder would tell you, we had to be our own Superman, and we had to really look for solutions because nobody was coming to our rescue. Next slide. So how did the work around environmental justice work or come to fruition? Well, it started with the 2014 Toledo water crisis, where we were without water in the greater Toledo area for approximately 3 days. And what we realized was our most vulnerable communities, like the Junction community, it really exacerbated and shined a light on what our disparities were. We got information late in terms of the notification letting us know that we couldn't, touch our water, couldn't even consume our water. And it really left our elderly, the nursing mothers and infants very in vulnerable states. I remember on that day having to literally go and call residents and neighbors, go door knocking to engage the community and let them know, our water isn't safe. And so after, that was resolved, Toledo became better about trying to protect our water. But what we didn't improve in was our community relations. How do we engage our communities? How do we assure them that our water source can be trusted and that the city has our best interest? Next slide. What it boiled down to is that, unfortunately, in most situations, the community had to be the ones to make the first move. We had to engage not only, our neighbors, but we had to engage our public officials. We did door knocking. We sent out flyers just to our neighborhood residents, because the first thing you have to do is, in a community like this, where there are so many other challenges that we're faced with, when you talk about unemployment, when you talk about having this food desert and having to drive nearly to 20 to 30 minutes just to get to a viable grocery store, when you talk about having to send your kids to school and not having running water in your home, when you talk about exposing your kids to the lead, not having a choice but to expose your kids to lead service lines because you can't afford to get those replacements done. We wanted to hear from our community about, all right, this is our time to take back our power and tell our public officials what we want to see in our community, what is plaguing us, and what we want to see, happen. We wanted to bridge the gap between toxins and everyday life, because like I said, when you have all that long list of disparities and issues that you're worrying about, you're not thinking about your water. Oftentimes water is a resource that most of us, whether you're wealthy or poor, take for granted. And so we don't really put the importance of, protecting it at, in our top list of priorities. We engaged in multi-generational connection and pro-social skills, meaning that we realized that this work that we were doing had to be sustainable. We are a community that is, has a homes with multi-generations living in those homes. And when, our social justice warriors age and they leave us, who's going to take up the mantle and continue this work? So we start to develop the young people like myself working in our communities and continuing that work. We're focusing on green technology, because what we realized is what happened with the harmful algal blooms, on the lake, it was a mixture of the CAFOS farms as well as urban runoff. And so we wanted to do our part and reduce the urban runoff, even though it's a small part in comparison. Next slide, please. And so in terms of what citizen action around the environmental issues looks like I said, we had to do a lot of convincing, not just of our neighbors, but also of our city government. We had to, and a lot of times they weren't always willing to listen. So we had to influence public opinion, urge action from local officials by writing op-eds, by taking out ads in the paper, gathering and recording community stories. As it relates to lead specifically, we have two stories that I can recall. Mr. Delta been living without his water for 2 years. And why that was because he couldn't get his water reconnected due to a leaking pipe. A lot of times in Toledo, they won't repair your pipes if there's an issue with the pipes. And they told him, you get those repairs on your lead on your service line, and we'll be able to restore your water. Well, 2 years later, and after we engaged Mr. Delta and we talked to him and we said, okay, this is what we're working to do, we pressured the city to come back out and take another look at his line 2 years later, because originally they told him that the leaking was on his side, the private side. What we found was the leaking was actually on the public side. So 2 years later, he's been living without his water because the city told him that there's nothing that they could do for him. Well, through community engagement, through community action and power, we said, no, let's revisit the situation. And what we found was it was actually on the city side. And so now he's able to get his job back because he was jobless and due to, not having any running water. He's got his job back, he's got running water, but that is the power of what community engagement and what neighbors helping neighbors looks like. So we've been forming committees within the Junction community to divide and conquer our responsibilities because, while environmental justice is crucial, we still have the social impacts of living in this area, in a low socioeconomic area. And so we divide these responsibilities among our neighbors that live in this area. We also host town halls to regularly keep the neighborhood informed. And I'm telling you, we serve over 7,000 residents, but I can tell you that we probably get about 20 or 30 people at those town halls on a regular day, which is fine. It's no matter how small the number is, you can still be effective in doing this work. Most recently, and I'll talk about this more in my next slide when we talk about relationships, but we Junction Coalition, along with our partners like Freshwater Future, have formed this water task force to really tackle these environmental issues head on. And it gave the people on the ground a seat at the decision-making table, where a lot of times you have people at the city and their utilities telling you what they're going to do to you. We get to sit down and create those solutions together, talk about what's going to benefit all of us in this city. And then lastly, to really just continue to sustain that, inspiration and that power within our communities, we do a lot of art and culture expression about what water means to us, about how important it is to keep it safe. And then there's a mural at the end that you'll get to see that represents that water, that connection to water. Next slide. And so this next couple of slides are really just going to be pictures so that you can see, in the middle there, those are our town hall meetings. These are green infrastructure projects that we've gotten funding for through people like Freshwater Future, through the Toledo Metropolitan Group, through a number of partners who've been really instrumental in helping us build capacity and bring these green infrastructure projects to reality. There's a rain garden. We have food gardens because this is a food desert. We don't have a grocery store in this area. Next slide. We're engaging the future, making it sustainable, talking about how do you build that next generation of leaders. You get them involved, you get them planting trees now, going out on the river, understanding the importance in building that connection between, like I said, bridging the gap between toxins and everyday life. It's not something we think about all the time, but we should. And what better way than to get hands-on experience. At the bottom left corner there, you'll see that we're discussing, we took some youth with us to talk at the Ohio State House with our representative, Paula Hicks Hudson. And that was crucial to their development so that they can see that you not only are working in your community, but there's another level and there's another tier to that engagement. Talking with your public officials, letting them know that you're not a politician, you are a public servant. You're here to serve your constituents. Next slide, please. And so our current environmental focuses are the lead line replacements, water affordability, and really trying to reduce that harmful algal bloom exposure. Some of our wins in doing this work, and especially as it relates to lead, is we have built a wonderful partnership with Freshwater Future. And through that partnership, we've gone, and the crazy thing is that you'll have the Department of Utilities and they'll listen to the people. But if Freshwater Future came in Toledo and said, hey, Toledo Department of Utilities, this is what the EPA is saying we need to do with lead line service replacements, it's not going to really be well received. But if you have community there saying, yeah, this is what we need, and telling them that, yeah, we're bringing Freshwater Future to the table to help us inform us on what these environmental issues are, they'll be more likely to listen. And they were. We have this task force, and up until Christy, you can confirm, I think March, which is when our director of the Department of Utilities said he's not doing any more partial lead line replacements. That was the power of bringing Department of Utilities and community to the same table, and community compelling the Department of Utilities to listen to these experts who's done this research, who've seen the harm, and can tell us partials are not good. They do just as much harm, if not more. And so we're no longer doing partial lead line replacements in the city of Toledo. Another one of our wins is understanding that part of the cost of trying to replace these lead line doing lead line replacements is finding these lead lines. And so we've partnered with Blue Conduit and brought them to the table. They're going to use artificial intelligence to locate these lead lines within the city of Toledo, making the replacement process more effective and more cost efficient. And so again, that came from the partnership that Freshwater Future had with Junction Coalition. And so we brought them to the table and we said, Department of Utilities, we hear you. We understand this is an expensive process. Blue Conduit is here to show you how we can reduce the cost and prompt you to do more lead line replacements in the city. And so we collaborated, all three of those entities collaborated, and we were awarded a grant from the EPA to really launch this program to do lead line replacements. That is what the power of community engagement can be. We can be that middleman. We can be that, not only just the middleman, but also the informing agent to let our cities know that these are our issues, and we're far from, reaching our finish line. There's still a lot of times where we get pushed to the side and we aren't listened to, even with our amazing success rate. And that's okay. But we're teaching people how to treat us. We're teaching people how to engage community the correct way, not going in and telling community what you're going to do, but allowing community to tell you what needs to happen. Next slide, please. And so, as I think I touched on before, relationships are everything. And that's a quote from Monica Lewis Patrick, who is a water warrior out of Detroit with We the People of Detroit. She's a veteran in terms of these issues of water. And the reason why we say relationships are everything, if you haven't already kind of heard it throughout my entire spiel, our relationship with Freshwater Future garnered this relationship, a working relationship with our Department of Utilities, which a lot of communities can't speak to. We've been able to have policy informed because of our relationship. We've had information sharing. They're giving us data on what our water shutoff rates are and where those locations are. It's opening doors for us to meet with our legislators and tell them exactly face to face what's plaguing our communities. And Junction Coalition members, like I said before, was able to introduce Blue Conduit and get that funding to do full lead line replacements. And so just to highlight a few of our partners that has been engaging with us in these environmental issues up until this point, our city council district rep, Freshwater Future, the city utilities and other departments, the University of Toledo, Fifth Third Bank. I mean, it's truly a coalition of people coming together to address these environmental justice issues. But it started with the community. It started with the residents. Who better to tell you what is happening in these communities than the people who live there? And there you can see a picture of some of our youth with Marcy Captor, who is a native of our area, this District 4 area, and so holds a special place in her heart for Junction. Next slide. I think that might be the last one. Yep. So thank you all for your time. This is the mural that I referenced earlier. That is actually right up the street from my house, and it's understanding our culture and connecting it to the importance of water. That's all I have. If there are any clarifying questions, I'm happy to take them. But other than that, thank you. Wendy, I don't know.
Okay, no clarifying questions, but we do have a whole bunch of questions coming in. And so they're just sort of flowing in, and I'm going to start with Tom. Tom, how might the changes to the lead and copper rule affect Ohio? What might change?
Well, Ohio, as Christy pointed out, passed that 512 back in 2016. And that really moved forward on the testing and the notifications when there's a problem. But it didn't move forward on the inventory very far. So I think the federal law is going to require that utilities not only be honest about where the lead is, what's unknown and where it's not, but that they also provide notices to customers and the people who drink the water. And that'll happen annually. New customers will get the notice, and you're going to see a lot more communication. And for those 24 largest cities that serve over 100,000 customers, they're going to make online maps available. And there's a tool through a group called Esri that does ArcGIS that makes maps really easily obtained. So you can get them developed, a community can develop them very easily. And then we got to still find a community that will overlay where the paint is. Patterson, New Jersey has done it, thanks to a really good health department working with the utility. They're they've got it done. They just don't have it posted yet. So that'll happen soon.
Thank you, Tom. We have questions about Blue Conduit. Who is Blue Conduit? How do you get in touch? How did you find them? How do you get in touch with them? And what could they do in Ohio?
Well, a Blue Conduit actually came to us by way of Freshwater Future. They're a company that is specialized in using their artificial intelligence technology to locate lead lines. So what I heard from Tom is that a lot of the issue with doing lead line replacements is finding where they are. And Toledo hasn't done a really good job of that. Blue Conduit has experience doing this in other communities. And what they do is they use the city history and information based on that historical information of that city and that neighborhood. They're able to kind of boil it down into where the most populated areas of lead lines are likely based on the age of the homes, based on the last development project that took place in the neighborhood. They take all of those parameters and that information that they gather from the city, and they kind of create sort of I don't know the exact technology behind it. I recommend bringing Blue Conduit on because they're amazing. To locate those lead lines and create a more efficient way of locating, because every time you drill into those neighborhoods to find these lead lines, that's a cost associated with just drilling that hole. And so if you can reduce the amount of holes that you have to dig to locate those lines, you can significantly reduce the cost of these repairs and these replacements.
And just two other features. Toledo was one of 4 communities picked by, I think it's funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, to help Blue Conduit come into those communities. So Toledo is being singled out as really trying to figure this out, and that's a real grab. That'll draw national attention. It does fee for services, so it could be available to other communities. And the part that's fascinating about them is, as the community does more testing and learns more and gets feedback, that's the artificial intelligence. It gets better. So you begin to predict more closely so that when you go into work on a home, you can work on it with more confidence, as Alexis said. It's a real good job by both Junction Community and Freshwater Futures to make that happen.
So there's involvement by the philanthropic community, and there was also a grant from the EPA, I think I heard you say, Alexis, to Toledo. Was that a US EPA grant or an Ohio EPA grant?
I believe it was Ohio. Christy, you might be able to.
It's a US EPA grant that they received to work with Blue Conduit, and some funding went to Freshwater Future to do some education, and I'm not sure. I think there might have been filters in there too, but education on lead service lines and filters. Yeah.
Okay, and we have a follow-up question on that point exactly. Someone said, I'm also interested in learning about filters and filter education and about who pays for that kind of service and assistance. And I'm going to throw that out to the group.
Well, I think so. Some organizations get grants to do that work. And I will say Freshwater Future does have some grant opportunities for folks to apply to for this type of work. They're small, they're not big, but they are useful for communities to be able to educate. Sometimes you can find grants at the state or federal level, or even foundations. And sometimes, maybe even working with the city, they may be willing to put up some funding. I know, not for this particularly, but the city of Toledo did put forward $2 million to do some lead service line replacement.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Junction Coalition is a nonprofit, so most of our services are through grant opportunities. So we not only Freshwater Future, but through Fifth Third Bank, through American Rivers, Alliance for the Great Lakes. I mean, we reach out and we write grants all the time to get funding for these projects. And a lot of times, places, organizations like Freshwater Future train particular neighborhood residents, and then those neighborhood residents can go into their communities and train even more people, so to continue that sustainability of that information.
It sounds as if the action's bubbling from the ground up through community organizing. And a couple of questions on that. I guess starting with Alexis, did the water issue really sort of wake the community up and get them activated? Was that the silver lining in the Toledo water crisis? Or was the community awake and activated because you'd been working since you and your friends had been working since you were 12 years old? You already had an existing organization in place. How did the history and the crisis interact in making you the successful organization that you are today?
Sure. So I will say that the community was already active and awakened in terms of working on other issues. So social justice issues, addressing our high crime rates, addressing the unemployment rate. Those are things we were focusing on. It really wasn't until 2014 when the crisis hit that we started focusing on the water issues. So you can say that the water crisis was sort of the catalyst to get us involved in now looking at environmental justice issues. So I want to say both. We've been doing this work, but it wasn't until that crisis that we started working on water issues.
Okay. And then there's a follow-up question to that. What's the most challenging part of community organizing and outreach? Is it teaching? Is it advocacy for action? Is it getting youth involved? What's the most challenging aspect?
I would say, particularly in our community, the biggest challenge that I can remember when we did door knocking was, really inspiring people to care about these issues. But what we found was that if you go in not necessarily telling people what it is that's going to happen and asking them what they would like to see, you have a better rate of success in terms of getting people at the table, getting people to come to these meetings. We went around and we asked, okay, what is it that you would like to see happen in your community? People said we wanted better lighting. We have like our street lights in our area are like non-existent. Some people were saying we want something done about all these vacant lots and homes that are eyesores in our community. We want something done about our sidewalks. You know, we don't have walkable sidewalks. So we really heard people in terms of what issues they saw in their community and they wanted to fix. And it took a lot of trial and error. A lot of times it was, you know, continue to be resilient even if you only had 5 people show up to the meeting. It was continuing to it was being persistent, it was being consistent, because a lot of times community have heard this story before. They've heard someone say, oh, we care and we want to help. And then, you know, a couple of days in and people have forgotten about them. So it was being consistent. It was meeting people where they were and meeting their needs first instead of telling them what needs to happen. And so our biggest challenge at first is getting the people power, getting the numbers. But when you're less concerned about the numbers and meeting people's needs, you have a better success rate.
Okay, thank you, Alexis. Go ahead, Christy.
Yeah, that was great, Alexis. Thank you. I would also say that sometimes the sustaining it, because these things take a long time and you know, resources are pretty thin, and community members also have full-time jobs, they have children, they have hobbies, they have other things too. And also, you know, I think one of the things that if people are thinking about community engagement, also making sure that they're compensated for their time and for their knowledge too. And so a lot of times, like, we're really advocating for some funding to go to community members to participate in this process, because it is really a lot of time. It takes a lot of resources.
That is 100%. I would say that might be number one, Christy. So thank you for bringing that up.
Tom, we've got some questions for you. How important has community engagement been in your work, and how has it affected the projects that the Environmental Defense Fund works on?
Well, it's critical because if the communities are going to be crafting their plans, it doesn't work if it's just a top-down program. EPA can set the stage, but you still need leadership from the utilities. And Alexis, it was really good to hear how you've been able to move Toledo water utility forward. So almost all the folks that I meet in water utilities are public health professionals. They get it. They may be so used to it that they forget the community engagement side. Some have enough support, like Greater Cincinnati Waterworks, to be able to sort of do it on their own and lead the community engagement. But many of them, it doesn't happen easily or naturally. So they really need the community to tell them what's needed and to make things a priority. That's what happened, I think, in Toledo. So it doesn't work without it. And it also needs the healthy homes people, because too often we find the public health people, the healthy homes people, seeing that this is competing for scarce resources, that every dollar to pipes is one less dollar for paint. And that narrow-minded view undermines the overall effort. We've got to make the pie bigger. There's not enough on paint. There's not enough on pipes. But for pipes, there's an opportunity to bring in more. And I would challenge people to say, and if money comes for pipes, there also needs to be more support for paints. It's both. And if we make it a competition, we're going to lose.
So would you say that's your top priority for Ohio? What's your top priority?
I think it really is. Before it would have been doing an inventory and getting the maps out. I think that's critical. I think it's going to happen anyway because of the federal law. But what really has to happen is funding for those environmental justice communities. Because the last thing we need to do is say, well, if you've got the money, you can buy your way out of and get a full lead service line replacement. But if you don't, you're going to get more exposures. You're going to have to put up with filters and ultimately still have to get the line out eventually. We've got to find a way to deal with those disparities. That may be doing no partials. That may be in funding the utility to be able to cover that additional cost. it maybe being able to fold it into the rate. There's lots of solutions. I don't suggest I've got the solution, but the funding to be able to make it possible for the utilities that are already struggling to make it happen is the key.
Thank you. And Christy, what's your top ask for policy at the state level?
Well, I think my top ask I did lay out, right? It's a pretty long list.
Good list.
I would say also that we need to really make sure that there is funding for community members that can't afford to replace their private side. It's so important. I think a lot of times we just think, or we see, well, we'll just fold it into the rates, or we'll, you know, the public side will replace their line, and then the left with the private side still trying to figure out how to replace their side, or we'll continue to use orthophosphate, and you know, we're not really reducing costs. If we can replace that lead service line completely, maybe we can start to reduce some of the orthophosphate costs too to the utility. But I did put a very long list together: ban partial, you know, full lead line replacement, funding to make that happen. We do have a request into the finance committee for the capital budget. Not very clear if the capital budget is going to happen this year in Ohio. We hear it is, then we hear it's not, then we hear it is. But it would be for a pilot program in Toledo of $1.95 million to replace the private side of some 526 homes that are really struggling to make ends meet. And so the city of Toledo has put forward $2 million. And so I think this could be a really great pilot program. Hopefully we'll see that happen. But as we know, you know, COVID and all the other demands, it's still up in there. But we're continuing to press for it, and we'll see what happens.
It's a big ticket item. These the costs are enormous, and that means it's a political item. Tom, tell us about how politics play into this on the national level.
Yeah, and I can talk, Christy, you can cover the Ohio side. At the national level, it is not yet. It was bipartisan, that House bill, that funding, it was bipartisan. 8 Republican representatives stood up and voted in support of it. But what you'll find is the state level, Indiana, where I've spent most of my adult life, and Wisconsin, the efforts to provide the funding by allowing the rates at the state level go up was done and put forth by really conservative Republicans who said that this is empowering a community to be able to do it. Now that increases the rates on people. That's why the additional funding for those communities that have that are older communities that are struggling with higher rates is important. But they both, in Indiana and in Wisconsin, conservative Republicans were the ones that put forth the proposals, made it happen. They got broad support from the Democrats, and they made it happen. But there were leading Republicans who saw that lead is a problem for kids. And when we think about it as cardiovascular disease, it's also for adults, especially those older ones that you may find in the legislature. How's it in Ohio?
Yeah, in Ohio, I'd say it's pretty similar. It's very much bipartisan. I think you see like Governor DeWine's a Republican. He's put forward this task force, but also down at the state house, we've talked to, you know, both House members and senators that are Republicans and Democrats, and it's an important issue. I think the issue is that there's so much that they have to know, right? We have a big job of educating them on the importance of this. And so we're doing that work. And we're being consistent and persistent. And so hopefully we'll see some good movement here soon.
Good.
This feels to me like a capital budget issue. The general revenue fund is under so much pressure right now with the needs of the recession, a budget shortfall, and so forth. But the capital budget, any budget move in Ohio takes tremendous energy. So you all have laid out great ideas for action. I'm going to ask you to reiterate, what's your top line? What do we need to do to create awareness, engagement, empathy, and the energy to restore investment in communities and make a big investment for health, for education, sort of across all of Ohio's communities, for all of our kids and our adults. What's our top line action that you would recommend taking as we go into this new budget year? Why don't we start with Alexis? What's your top line action that we should take to encourage policymakers to want to invest in our communities?
Sure. Well, I'll tell you that the strategy has been different based on who we've talked to in terms of politics. When we've gone before our Congress and state, and not state reps, but state reps. We talk economics more so with our Republican counterparts, and we talk more relationship when it comes to Democrats. But really, what the bottom line is that you have to have community at the table. You're not going to be able to understand, have empathy if the people there to create that aren't at the decision-making table. When we go to DC or when we go to the Ohio State House, we have community members there, and we're compensating them for their time because they are taken away from their day jobs to talk about what is important to them and what is happening. We have a very tall order to meet, but it's at least hearing the stories of the communities that I think really create that picture in our mind in terms of what's happening on the ground.
Thank you. Christy?
Well said.
Yeah, I'm taking notes. This is great. Christy, why don't you tell us what's the top line thing we need to do to make our policymakers want to invest? Give them the will.
Well, I think building off of Alexis, we really need the community members in each community to be at the table, to understand these issues, to listen to them, and to bring forth their concerns to their lawmakers. One of the things that we very much do is open those doors and help community members get the seats at the table or talk to their legislators, whether it be at or their decision makers at the local, state, or national or regional level. So it's really about understanding what the community needs are and bringing it forth to the legislators, and then understanding the legislator as well and what is their motive. So Alexis is absolutely correct. Talking about economics is something that I've continually been asked about from Republicans, where I'm not so much from the Democrats. They're more concerned, what I hear in my experience is people's public health. And so understanding your community and understanding your target. That sounded bad. Understanding who you're trying to talk with.
Thank you. And Tom?
I would just put in 2 quick points, and that is, and do engage with your water utility. I think you'll find a more receptive audience there than you'll imagine. They know they've got a problem. It's hard to say, I don't know, but if you're there talking to them, it'll make it a lot easier. And they can be very supportive. It may take some time in building trust, but it's worth it. The other one is the public health, local health department. Sometimes they just get focused on their role, which is often paint, and ignore the pipes. They care deeply about lead. They often will say, well, we don't see it in our community, and that's because you're not testing the right kids. They see it when they finally test the kid at 1, when they may have been poisoned from the infant formula. So please think about the public health community and the water utilities. They can be critical partners that strengthen your voice and expand your impact.
Thank you so much. Go ahead.
Just one last point is that one of the issues too in our community that we found is not also just the poverty of dollars, but a poverty of information. There is there's an aging community here that doesn't have access to, internet or, to those readily available information websites and things. So making sure that you're getting out the information, if you're a city entity, a utility, what those changes are, what the issues are, dispersing them in a fair and equitable manner also really matters.
Thank you. And to summarize very briefly what people have said, Alexis advised us to address the poverty of information, inform the community, bring them to the table, and recompense them for the time that they take off for their jobs. Christy said, know your community and know your legislator. What do they care about? Emphasize those points. Tom said, talk to a couple of stakeholders we haven't emphasized yet much today. Talk to your public water department. Talk to your public health department. They got a problem. They know it. We have about 4 minutes left. I'm going to ask our panelists if there are additional parting comments that we haven't covered today that you want to make sure our listeners, who we're very grateful to, hear.
Just thank you for having me.
Yeah, and thanks for being here. And I do, just from a national context, Michigan, Ohio was an early actor on this one, thanks to the 512 bill in 2016, but it's really fallen behind in many ways. Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, New Jersey are all moving farther ahead. So I think Ohio needs to catch up.
I just yeah, it's so time to catch up. I just add thank you very much. Thank you for taking time on a Monday morning to join probably your 500,000 Zoom webinar. Maybe someday we'll be able to be in person again.
Hopefully, yes.
Keep in mind that the people that the panelists that have been speaking this morning are resources for you. The Environmental Defense Fund is a wellspring of information. Freshwater Futures has brought great resources to cities in Ohio and throughout the Midwest and Canada. And Junction Community is a very successful community organization. Alexis can give you information. Download the handout. Call us anytime. We look forward to talking to you.
Excellent. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.